It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Karen Conrad, and we're going to be discussing her new book, The Promise of Purpose: Proven Strategies to Reach Your God-Given Potential. Karen, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It is an honor to be here.
Well, Karen, you and I bump into each other from time to time with my work with Harrison House and you being one of our authors and working with other authors professionally. But I know you're going to be brand new to much of my audience. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Karen Conrad origin story for all the men and women meeting you for the first time today. What are a few things they should know about you?
Oh, great. Thank you, Shaun. Well, I'll tell you, I'm like the typical small town girl. If you were to go back and look at my roots, I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, about 2,500 people. I was the kid that walked beans in the summer, spent time out at my grandma's farm growing up, learned how to garden. Really just a very typical, common, wonderful growing up. And in that process, I was so blessed with my family, which was a big impact on me. And I went into banking, which is where my family was, moved to the Twin Cities, got married, had an awesome child, Levi, started moving up the ranks in my professional development in banking. And then in 2010, I'll tell you, my whole life changed in an instant, which actually catapulted the book, The Promise of Purpose.
And being a Minnesota native, I got to ask, where did you grow up in Minnesota?
I grew up in a small town called Wells, Minnesota. So
I don't even know where that is.
I was going to say, if you're from Minnesota, it's kind of like between Albert Lee and Mankato. It's a couple hours south of the Twin Cities, but definitely in one of those areas that is not necessarily notable to the rest of the world.
Well, let's get into that theme of purpose from your book. As you just alluded to, you went through very dramatic life changes unexpectedly. And I know you just entered into a new season of going places you never thought you'd go. So talk to us about that journey of maybe rediscovering purpose and how did that purpose get reignited or maybe ignited for the first time with things that were new in your life?
Yeah, absolutely, Shaun. So, as I mentioned, I was in banking for 25 years. I really felt that my life was laid out before me and it was unfolding just as I had planned. And in many ways, and I think we can all relate to that, sometimes it's just what we knew. It's only what we knew that was, a potential for a future. And moving along in life, it was going well. And one day in 2010, as I was in a bank, my human resources manager came into my office and she had a stern kind of look on her face, not the usual smile, very serious. She sat down, she slid a piece of paper across the desk to me, and she said, Karen, you need to call this phone number. It is about Tim, who was my husband at the time. And I thought it was our president elect at the bank, Tim. So I was like, well, what's going on with Tim? And she looked at me and she said, no, Karen, you're Tim. You need to call this phone number. So I found out that it was Hennepin County Medical Center, which is a major medical center in the Twin Cities. And I thought I was calling to talk to the nurses station to find out what had happened, if I had to go pick him up, whatever it was. And it ended up that it was actually the coroner. And Shaun, in that moment, I had no warning. I learned that my husband of 19 years, the father of our 16-year-old son, had passed away at 8 a.m. that morning. Suddenly, my entire life that I was comfortable with, I thought I was on track with, just shattered before me. And everything that I had my identity in, you might say, was sort of pulled out from under me. And it was during that time, even though it was very difficult, I will tell you, Shaun, that as I really sought the Lord on this, walked through some very challenging things that I talk about in The Promise of Purpose, It was on that journey that I actually discovered what it meant when God said that He has got a plan and a purpose for our life, and that it is something bigger and better than anything that we could ask, think, or even imagine.
And in terms of purpose, I'd love to have you speak to, you know, should we keep it compartmentalized or should it spill over into all areas of life? 'Cause I think we'll tend to be like, oh, purpose in my spiritual life or purpose in my career, or but I always feel like it's got to be more of an all encompassing purpose that impacts all the spheres of places that we influence. That there should be overlap and spillover everywhere. Because I feel like if we get stuck where we only focus on purpose in one place, we really neglect having purpose impact really important relationships and other things that we also need to be investing time in and make a part of our planning process.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. And that's part of the challenge sometimes that when we go to church, we kind of think we've got our church bucket or our God bucket, then we've got our family bucket, our career bucket. And God is saying, I want to be part of every area of your life and not only be a part of it, but there are promises in our purpose in every area of our life. And that was definitely my journey. I mean, I was like trying to figure out, oh my goodness, who am I now? Because I thought that I had everything together. And part of that journey helped me to understand, you know what? How am I made? How am I designed? Because God designs each of us uniquely. And really learning what my purpose was, discovering that, which I also share a lot about how to locate that purpose, does affect and spill over into every area of our life. And you know what, Shaun? It helped me to understand what I like to do. I'm yes, I enjoyed banking, but there was so much more that I could do when I understood my purpose. It helped me to understand even relating to my child, because there's things in us where we have a tendency that we want to deal with things a certain way. And a lot of times it's how we're designed, what our purpose is. And once I discovered that, it just enlightened every area of my life and opened up doors that I didn't even know were possible.
Well, and I can speak out of my own experience and stories that others have shared with me. I feel like sometimes we have purposes and kind of missions, if you will, for different seasons, but it can take the almost kind of destroying down to a foundational and rebuilding level for us to. I feel like being able to let go of the old purposes, the old missions, to step into what God has for us in the future. And that can be a painful process, but sometimes it can be a very necessary process. Be ready to step into what God has for us next. Sometimes those difficult, grieving, the things along the way that are hard, those can also be preparation for what is ahead. I feel like sometimes those things give us empathy for others. Sometimes it gives us an understanding and a depth that just would have been impossible without having walked through the valleys that we walked through. And so, that, and I can just speaking out of my own experience, there's different purposes for different seasons as we ebb and flow and move into new things. Some things get destroyed and new things get rebuilt, but that is just part of the journey. I want to have you talk to us now about the Discover Your Purpose test. I know people like tests and evals and tools to help them discover things. So tell us about some of the resources you have on your website related to the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have something called, you're exactly right, Discover Your Purpose. It's an evaluation tool. And it's really something I put together based on the journey that I was going through. And you are absolutely right about seasons. And when we understand that and we keep that purpose in front of us, we realize that there are things, there's a time and a place, things need to end and things need to begin. But some of the questions that I have in there are really insightful, but also very basic. One of the things that a lot of people think is that God's going to call them to do something that they don't like to do. That is not true. God has designed us for a purpose and He's put the desire in us. He says that He gives us the desires of our heart, meaning that He places those in us as we have a relationship with Him and He helps us to fulfill them. So, one of the questions is, what do you love to do? And I ask it like this: what do you do that you don't have to muster the energy up to do every day? And I've definitely got some really interesting answers from people on that. Another one was, this was big for me. because it was how, like, what are the things that I do that's easy for me and difficult for others? And when you mentioned the empathy, Shaun, this was an area, when God gifts us in an area, we kind of sometimes think, at least I did, like, well, this is how everybody thinks, this is what everybody sees. And what I began to realize is when I understood what those gifts are that He put in me, I valued those gifts. I was thankful for them. And I also realized that they were gifts God put in me that He didn't necessarily put in other people. So it brought about a humility that I really needed, because there were areas that, when we're in the area we're called to, things just are easier for us. One of the other things that I ask people is to look back on your life when you were in a job that you were enjoying, and all at once you just decided, I don't even like this anymore, or I want to quit and do something new, because that can be an indication that either we have got out of the flow of our purpose in working in that job, or it's time for a season change, and that we need to seek the Lord and say, are you moving me into the next step on this life's journey?
Yeah, there definitely can be a circumstance where I almost feel like God's covering or grace can lift off of a person or lift off of an organization. I've talked to many friends through the years who are like, I realized it was time to go because everything just kind of went to heck for no good reason. And I prayed about it, and God was like, I'm moving you into something new. So I feel like sometimes God allows us to get into that place where we're actually a little bit uncomfortable to help get our attention sometimes, that it's time to step into a new season. Next, I'd love to have you talk to us about fear of our purpose. I feel like obviously, our purpose often connects to things that we're just wired to do. We love, it's innate. But I feel like in terms of fear, sometimes there can be things like, "Oh, I could never do that," or "I don't want to do that," because we're afraid of stepping out or putting ourselves out there. And so sometimes I feel like we have a kind of a fear chasm to overcome, where actually the thing that scares us the most sometimes is the thing that God's calling us into. Talk to us about dealing with fear and our purpose. How do we overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a whole chapter dedicated to that topic, because what I learned in my journey too is that I was maybe afraid of failure, like to the point that it was almost paralyzing. But I also had this sort of fear of success. And one of the things that we need to remember as we walk through this, first of all, fear of man is something we have to really be aware of. We care about what other people think of us, whether it's a parent, whether it's coworkers, other people in business, whatever that might be. And when we are walking along with God in our purpose, one thing we've got to get a handle on is that fear of man, because God is going to call us to things that people may not understand, or it may be something almost always 100% of the time when God calls us to something, we are not going to know everything about that situation. And we're not necessarily going to feel equipped for what He calls us to do. That does stop a lot of people because they feel out of control, or that risk of failure or even risk of success can be overwhelming for people. But let me put people at ease here, Shaun. When God calls us to do something, there is always going to be a risk involved. The whole essence of an entrepreneur, for example, is to take on risk. However, when we know the voice of the Lord, which we do, and sometimes it's just an impression or a desire, like we've talked about, He wants us to lean into Him and be part of, we have to depend on Him for these things that He calls us to. So if we feel completely comfortable and we're not dealing with any of those fearful thoughts about what He's called us to, we're probably not pursuing what God has called us to do. And there's something I like to call AQ, the anointing quotient. And you guys might want to write this down, so it's going to help you when we are venturing into things. For example, right now, we've got a significant real estate business that our family is going into. And there are times during that process, we know we're called to do it. There's times during that process where, you know what, that renter didn't come as fast as we want. or maybe a bill came in that we didn't expect, or, I thought this would sell one day on the market and it's still sitting there. And we deal with those fearful thoughts like we're not going to have enough, but we remind ourselves that the anointing quotient is always there when we are following God's heart. Even if we make mistakes, we are after his heart in pursuing those. So you might say, I'm not smart enough. Well, AQ is better than IQ. We might say, I don't have enough money in the bank. We call that a WQ, wealth quotient, and AQ trumps that. Maybe we're dealing with a health issue. Well, what does God's word say about that? It says, I'm healed. So dealing with that fear, understanding how to walk through it, I actually give you a battle plan on how to overcome fear, because I was literally paralyzed after this event happened in my life. Is just part of life, and it's something God's already given us to overcome. He's got the victory for us, and we learn to walk through it in faith.
I'd love to have you talk a little bit more to that the fear of success. If you have examples from your own life or other people that you've worked with, 'cause I think people can get into this place where they get stuck in this loop where they get to the finish line of something and they'll self sabotage it, and it happens over and over again where there's a comfort in living in the not quite succeeding because you're afraid of, well, what's on the other side if I really succeed? And oftentimes, if we actually succeed in that major goal or task, it levels us up into something new or something different that would stretch us even further. So, I guess maybe what I'm trying to ask is, how do we break out of that cycle? Because the fear of success is a real thing that holds many people back, sometimes for multiple decades.
It really is. And another chapter I have in the book is called Glass Ceiling Shattered on Purpose. A lot of times, and I dealt with this, Shaun, a lot of times there are things that we have on the inside of us that are really doing that self sabotage, or stopping us from success. And I just identified four major areas that can happen. In one of the areas I see most frequently with people is relationships. It's like, somebody will pray for a husband, pray for their wife. They'll get in a relationship, and all at once they're like, "Oop, nope, I'm going to just end this." And it is like they self sabotage in the area of relationships. And a lot of times that can be based on our past experiences. It can actually be based on, we know each other too well. We know how human we are. We know all of our mistakes. So it can be this idea that we don't deserve this success. Sometimes we're believing lies, things that we have maybe said to ourselves, other people have spoken over us. And sometimes, and this is in the area of success that I see a lot with people in business, is a lack of humility or pride, but it's not in the way that we are taught. It's not in the way that says that, I think I'm great. And, we're just in that prideful, boastful space. It's really in the area of us looking at ourselves in the natural and not looking at our life through the lens of who we are in Jesus Christ. And when we look at what Jesus did for us, what he prepared, the gifts and talents he's put in us, that path to success that we are walking on, when we think it's us, it can be limiting. So when we change that around and we realize, you know what, it's not because Karen Conrad is super cool. It is because I've decided to humble myself and honor God through seeing myself through that lens of Jesus. And you know what? Then when we're successful, then when we climb to the top of that mountain that we're called to, when we are wealthy, we are not boasting on ourselves, but it's really in that serving and that honor and that love for what Jesus did for us. And I think when people realize that really their success should be a reflection of the beauty and the grace of Jesus, then we can get rid of those limits and we can see success as a gift that God has given us.
Next, I'd love to have you speak to us about working not necessarily just for a paycheck, but working for our purpose as well, and what's the difference there. But I guess the context I'd like to frame it is in different seasons of life, we do have those jobs or opportunities where we're solely doing it to earn income to have flow into other areas. We might have a job and a side hustle that more is fulfilling, and it really ties to our purpose. So, talk to us maybe about the ebbs and flows of the different seasons and balancing that. Because I'm thinking of some of my young adult children who are up and coming. You know, they want to have the job that fulfills their purpose and just makes life wonderful. Often, those sorts of jobs, I would say, what you're doing right now, what I'm doing right now, that comes after years of sometimes doing things that are really fulfilling and other times just doing stuff because you got to eat, you got to pay the bills. So, what's that balance between working for a paycheck and working for purpose as it spans different seasons?
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, definitely I lived through that. And one of the things, for 25 years, I collected a paycheck. Now, I'm not saying that that was God's best for me, but it was just all the knowledge that I had at that time. And I was a good steward of that the best way that I knew how. And in that season is when I learned so many things that I now have the character and the maturity to be able to walk through and apply in different areas of my life. But you're right, we do need a good work ethic. God, He is into work. A matter of fact, one of the ways that work is translated is worship. So there are times like walking beans, I can look back and it's like, that was an absolutely miserable job, right? But what did I learn? I learned to get my butt out of bed at 7 a.m. in the morning. I learned how to work and I was able to look back and I had some satisfaction. Those bean rows behind me were clean and I started to learn how to work and the value of work. Then I worked at a Dairy Queen, then I worked at a nursing home. I learned what I did like to do, what I didn't like to do. But in that process, there were things that I had to learn. And then as we move into getting married, having a family, buying our first house, there are seasons that we walk through. However, when I really encourage young people to like, this book is going to help you so much with that. And my son is 27 and he's been hearing this for a while. So where he is at 27, Shaun, compared to where I was at 27 is completely different. So I think too, we can concurrently walk through things. He's got a job, he does a fabulous job, but also he's got this understanding of how he's designed, really like what he loves to do. One of the things he learned is that he really, as someone that lost his dad at 16, he really has a heart to help other young men to really understand their identity and their masculinity, because we went through Wild Apart and things like that. So he is working at a job collecting a paycheck, but his heart is to really help those people that God has around him in this season, in this area of part of what he is called to do. And he's got this gig over here with real estate that he's able to work on the side. So that work ethic is absolutely critical. There's a season that he's learning how to communicate. We've all been through those things. So God has you on a path. And when we know, like, he formed our life, he has a plan for our life before we were even in our mother's womb. So when we step through these stages, they are going to look different. But keep in mind that there's a beautiful thread through our life. When you look back or you're in a season now and you say, Karen, I'm just not even excited about what I do, but God's called me there. Well, ask him to give you insight. Like, Lord, what am I to learn in this season? How can I fulfill the purpose you have for me where I'm at, and trust that those are things that he can build on as you step into that place where you're like, wow, this is amazing. I had no idea this was ahead of me.
That's solid advice. I can vouch for some of the things I learned in my most mundane jobs or things in the past. I'm amazed how those experiences come back around. Sometimes it's just in conversation or relating to people who you would have never guessed that this person, some person who's famous or well known, they did that same thing. And I feel like God doesn't waste any of it. Those connection points, those experiences, they come back around often at very unexpected times along the path, along the journey. Talk to us a little bit about navigating failures, or as I say, learning opportunities. Failure is part of life. We're going to come up against things that just don't go how we planned. There are many times we come up against things that no fault of our own. We just couldn't control the situation or all the circumstances. It's something falls apart or something doesn't go as we'd hoped it would, when we know our purpose and we're confident that we're on the right path that God has us on, how does that empower us, help us to deal with those times when we just hit a wall and it just doesn't go how we expected?
Oh, yeah, and I wish, I wish we didn't have to walk through these things, or I wish I could tell you, I've never had failures. Oh my goodness, I've walked through this. And you're right, we all walk through that. What I want to encourage people with is failures are not who we are. They might be events, but it's how we handle those failures. And so I'm going to give you a couple insights that I think are really going to help you. When I grew up, actually, I share a lot of this in the book too. For many years, wow, I never wanted to be the person to ever make a mistake, ever. So there was this opportunity that I had in banking. I was very young. I was about 27. And I was in with all older leaders. And I would go to a meeting. And if there was anything, Shaun, that would be something that looked like I might have made a mistake, I would work overtime to explain how I really didn't make a mistake. And maybe it could have even been someone else's fault, but it certainly wasn't going to be my fault. And so I was not exactly embracing failure at that point. And I had a very wise leader, and I didn't like to hear this at the time. But what she said, she pulled me in the office and she said, Karen, you do not need to be right all the time. And she went on to describe to me what I was just sharing with you. And what I had there at that aha moment was that was actually hurting my credibility rather than helping it. So it's sort of like this upside down thing we have to look at. And oftentimes the kingdom of God does look completely upside down to what we were used to. But what I needed to start to understand is that when I did hit those points that looked like failure, what was I going to learn from that failure or that mistake that I could apply and not do again later? We were watching Robert Kiyosaki. We really enjoy his teaching, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And he was sharing a conversation that he had when he left Xerox. And it was the last time that he collected a paycheck. And one of his coworkers looked at him and said, you know what? You are going to fail and you're going to be right back here. And Robert Kiyosaki at that point looked at him and said, I will probably fail, but I will not be back here. And the Bible tells us that a righteous man, somebody that loves God, we may fall 7 times, but you know what? We always rise up. And then there's a promise after that that we will get to a point that is even better than where we are when we had that failure. So when we look at that and we understand, look, the Bible tells us that many are plans in a person's mind, but it's the Lord's purpose that will succeed, not might succeed, will succeed. So what I learned to do is, and I hope this will help some of you too, is I learned to look at a situation going into it with all the risks, even after a mistake, and said, you know what? I've already succeeded here. So let's just settle that. All right. This is success and it's going to be good. But now I might have to deal with this situation. And as I started to look at things, understanding that my success is not dependent upon me being perfect and never making a mistake. And I can use those to get to a higher place. My second tip for you is Romans 8:28. I'll tell you, I love this scripture because it tells us even when things go wrong, Lord, you will make this for good. I have so many stories about times I've gotten myself into a mess. And you know what? I really couldn't blame anybody but myself. And in that moment, when it looks like all the pressure is coming on, Romans 8:28, Lord, I've messed up here. This did not go right, but I'm going to turn this over to you and I'm going to trust you to make this for my good. Then all at once that fear can be removed. We're not seeing through this cloudy lens of deception, being afraid of ourselves or failure. And God is able to open up the windows for us, the doors that is needed, and we can trust him that somehow, some way out of this mess, you're going to make it for good.
And in terms of the reader's journey with the book, they get to that last page, they close that back flap. what's the takeaway? How do you hope you've impacted every single person who encounters your message?
First of all, I want people to understand that God has created you for a purpose. There's so many people, and it saddens me with a lot of young people today. They're actually being told they're a victim, that they're just a massive, something matter thrown together. That's a lie. God has a purpose for each and every one of us. So that's first and foremost what I want people to understand. Second, we sometimes compare ourselves to other people, but God has created us as a unique person. And on this journey to understand that He made me so perfectly and with such detail, He actually knows He knows the number of hairs on my head, right? That's something where He didn't just throw me out there on the earth. He really thought about me and my his plan for my life. And so I want everybody to know you are created on purpose. God's designed you uniquely to fulfill that purpose. And in that purpose, you can expect to be loved, accepted, and you can go on an adventure with God that will influence and change the world around you and bless you beyond anything you could ever imagine. His plans for you are good and not evil, and they will result in an amazing life.
Well, Karen, thanks for ending us on such an encouraging note. For the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about you, your book, all the things, where are some of the places we can discover you on the web?
Oh, thank you. You can go to my website, karenconrad.net. I've got free resources, downloads, including that Discover Your Purpose test. So I want to invite you to take advantage of those at karenconrad.net. You can also go to promiseofpurpose.com and you can subscribe I've got a free 21-day video devotional that takes you through this book. And I've got a Promise of Purpose community that I would love to have you all join us. We minister to each other. I'm on there personally to help you on this journey to discover and fulfilling your God given purpose.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes to places where you can connect with Karen and pick up your very own copy of her new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Karen Conrad. Once again, our book today was The Promise of Purpose, Proven Strategies to Reach Your God-Given Potential. And Karen, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Shaun.